Hey guys, this is John. All right, I have a little treat for you today, and actually for the next several videos. We're going to be looking at my games from the recent Game in 45 plus 5 tournament that I played in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm recording this a week after the fact, but I was really flattered that many of you followed my progress in this event and also commented on the community post that I posted about the result of this particular tournament. So I won't spoil anything if you don't know the result yet. We're going to be looking at each of the 4 games that I played. And we start with where else? Round 1. So a little bit of background. This was actually a series of Rapid and Blitz tournaments, this particular event. It was called the Charlotte Memorial Rapid and Blitz Tournament. And this is the first of the events. It was on a Saturday. It took the entire day. Time control was game in 45 minutes with a 5-second increment. Okay, so both players get 45 minutes, and there's a 5-second increment throughout. The other 2 events, which I won't be covering because I don't have the scores from a lot of the games, were a game in 10 plus 3 tournament, another rapid event, and then a blitz tournament, which was 3 plus 2. But these were definitely the most serious of the games, the ones that I wanted to do the best in. And I have not played an event since 2019, an over-the-board serious event since 2019, pre-pandemic. So I was eager to get back at it and just move the pieces around on a physical board and experience all that over-the-board chess is. So I was really pumped to do that. And shout out to the Charlotte Chess Center crew. They're good friends of mine. I actually stayed a couple days after the tournament to hang out with them, and I gave a lecture at the Charlotte Chess Center one of the nights. They're awesome. Make sure you check out the club if you're ever in the area. All right, so round 1, I'm playing the black pieces against a local player, I believe. His name is Enzo Restelli. U.S. Chess Federation, 1796. Pretty young player. I think he was probably like 13, 14 years old, is 13 or 14 years old. And, you know, my general strategy when playing significantly lower rated players, as you might have seen from climbing the rating ladder and whatnot, is to try not to do too much. I don't play passively by any means, but I prefer not to get into complications. I like them to come to me. I try not to go out of my way to create chaos and enforce tactics on the board. I generally feel I'm going to beat players significantly lower rated than me based on my understanding and strategic feel, positional play, more so than tactics. Because if you get involved in a tactical slugfest, it kind of comes down to, are you right or wrong a lot of times? Have you calculated better, worse, equal than your opponent? I would prefer to play positions where the opponent has many, many different options. Then it's harder for them to find the best move. Likewise, it's harder for me to find the best move, but I can kind of trust that based on my advantage with rating and experience, it's going to be harder for them than it is for me. So in a nutshell, that's my strategy. All right, enough preamble. Let's get into the game. So I'm playing black here. Enzo opened with e4, and I responded with, what else, guys? The Scandinavian defense, d5. So I was thrilled to be able to play this in my first game. Many of you who have followed my videos in recent months will know that I'm working on a course on the Scandinavian defense that I'm going to be telling you a lot more about. I'm still working on it. And I love to play the openings that I'm studying. And especially if I'm working on some sort of resource, I try to just play it a lot and get a lot of practical experience in it. Many of the games I play online and possibly in person too end up making it into the course because I have firsthand knowledge. So I encourage you to do that with your openings. Like, don't just study an opening passively. Even if you're not sure that you fully understand an opening yet, go ahead and play it. I mean, you don't have to play it in your city championship or something, but go ahead and play it, at least in your online games, unrated casual games. You need that experience, and it can be a good catalyst to looking up the theory of the opening and understanding it better. So I've been playing the Scandinavian for many, many years, but we get e4, d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5. Enzo plays knight c3, the most common move by far, attacking my queen. Now, I wrote a course on queen d8 for Chessable way back in 2016. There's also the move queen d6, which is, I'd say, a pretty dynamic move where there are many possible setups. But I played queen a5 here, and this will be the focus of my upcoming course. It's going to be a holistic repertoire on the Scandinavian, so it will cover move 2 alternatives, everything reasonable that white can throw at you. But make no mistake, a lot of the course will be on this position after queen a5. This variation used to be regarded a bit suspiciously, I'd say up until about 5 to 10 years ago, it started to have a reevaluation of the theory, and black started playing it in a slightly different way, which we're not exactly going to see in this game, but you'll be hearing more about that in the future. So queen a5, we put the queen off on the side of the board. It's quite safe there, and it can be active. A lot of times it'll be pinning the knight when white moves the d pawn. It's definitely more of an active post than coming back to d8, which I would say is just more solid and dependable. So my opponent plays d4 here, one of the main moves, just occupying the center, knight f6, knight f3, and now I play bishop f5. Okay, so this is the preferred way to handle the queen a5 Scandinavian these days. Play knight f6 first, and then play bishop f5 if allowed. It's also possible for black to play c6. This is sort of a more old-fashioned way of handling the position, creating an escape square for the queen. However, there are certain advantages to playing bishop f5, and if allowed, black actually may look to play e6 and bishop b4, and potentially put the knight on c6. Put the queenside knight on c6 rather than the pawn. And that's a setup that a lot of players who are excited about the queen a5 Scandinavian and have begun playing it in recent years have gone for from the black side. So here, my opponent played bishop d2. Now, this is game 45. You have to make pretty quick decisions. And my opponent was already starting to think quite a bit. He had spent a considerable amount of time, I'd say, for these first 6 moves. And I was feeling pretty good, having looked at a lot of this stuff recently. This is actually one of the more dangerous move orders, bishop d2, taking aim at the queen. And I decided to react to this move by playing knight bd7. Okay, knight bd7. And this may look a little odd that, first of all, I'm ignoring potential discoveries on the queen, and also I'm committing the knight here versus playing e6, c6, or even keeping open the option of knight c6. However, a little bit of nugget of information for you. Let's say black were to play e6 here. This is a common recommendation in modern Scandinavian resources. I don't mean modern variation, just more up-to-date resources on the queen a5 line. And this move is playable. However, I do believe black really has to know their stuff if white decides to go knight e5 specifically here, which contains a number of venomous ideas. Knight c4, going after the queen on a5. Also g4. Also g4, looking to potentially embarrass this bishop. And in fact, if black doesn't know what they're doing, they can easily get a bad position. The best move here is queen b6, attacking the pawn on d4. But white has this reply queen f3, where they actually leave 3 different pawns under attack. And I'm not going to go into a long theoretical discussion here, but suffice it to say, black really has to understand this line, know a lot of theory, and I personally don't like to allow this. I wouldn't recommend going for this from the black side. And that's one thing I've discovered in researching this bishop d2 variation. So I prefer knight bd7 here, guarding the e5 square, taking away the option of knight e5, and basically acknowledging that I'm not afraid of this knight jumping somewhere with the discovery on the queen. The discovery that you most often have to worry about is knight d5, hitting the queen and trying to attack c7. But note here that this just doesn't work because black has queen takes d5. Okay? So kind of playing off of that, my opponent replied with bishop c4. All right, now knight d5 actually is a threat. If I fall asleep here and play e6, looking to perhaps play bishop b4, well, I'm going to be in a world of hurt after knight d5 because of what I just mentioned, where my queen will be unable to remain guarding the pawn on c7. I'm going to have to sacrifice the queen for 2 pieces here, most likely. So bishop c4 was played, but now I play c6, creating a little window for the queen. And I just mentioned how often black is not trying to play in this way, but with this particular move order, I do recommend going for this, and the control of the e5 square that black has decided to undertake by virtue of this knight bd7 move order is worth it, in my opinion. So c6, this gets ready to meet knight d5 with queen d8. If white were to play this way, we're all good. And a nice little bonus of knight bd7, if black faces the capture here, they can recapture with the knight. Keep things nice and seamless. Haven't had to mess up the pawn structure in any way. That's sort of reminiscent of the Karpov-Smyslov variation of the Caro-Kann for knight d7, if you're familiar with that line. So c6, my opponent plays queen e2 here. One other option, by the way, if white tries to blow up the center with the move d5, looking on c takes d5 to then play knight takes d5, black can meet this with queen c5, hitting the bishop, also threatening to take this pawn. This is no problem for black, just in case you were wondering. So queen e2, this reinforces the bishop. It hints at white potentially castling queenside. And I decided to play queen c7 here. This was still within my realm of knowledge. I do voluntarily retreat in this position. It's possible the queen can overstay her welcome on a5. Again, if I play e6, this d5 move is something I have to reckon with. Here, note that queen c5 won't work as well because the bishop is defended on c4, so white could actually just take on e6 here without any issue. And my last move was looking kind of silly. So queen e2, I have to be on ball that d5 is more of a concern, and white may look to castle queenside. So I play queen c7. My opponent castles kingside. This surprised me a little bit. Again, he's using a fair amount of time, and we have to understand the dynamics. He's playing an international master. He's playing far up in rating. It's the first round. I'm sure he's trying to be careful and maybe defer to my rating a little bit. I've been in that situation. I know what that's like. So he castles short. I do think it's much more ambitious to castle long. You will find that in the Scandinavian and many other openings too, such as the Sicilian. In the open Sicilian, most of the critical lines for white are connected with castling long. So I was expecting that, and I would have played e6 here, after which there are quite a few games where white tries to prosecute the slight advantage that they have in development, and with black's king in the center. But long story short, black is pretty solid here and has fighting resources. White usually plays knight e5, outposting the knight. Knight h4, going after the bishop, is common too. Sometimes they play rook he1. But black can play this in a number of ways. It may look logical for black to castle queenside, but it's actually entirely possible that black will start getting a little aggressive on the queenside even, with plans like this, indicating, hey, I might just pawn storm you because I'm confident in my defense of the e6 pawn, for instance, and the safety of my king here. Sometimes black will play b5, b4, and just immediately cook this knight. Did I say cook? I meant kick. Possibly cook as well. Kick the knight. Sometimes black may just develop too. They may ultimately play bishop e7 or bishop d6. This looks a lot like a Caro-Kann. And you could see castling on either flank. So I wasn't at all scared of white castling queenside, but that would have led to a much more interesting fight. I think it's a little more ambitious of a move because with castles queenside, this rook on d1 has the chance to get in the game quicker. Whereas when you castle kingside, because this rook is not immediately in the game is more likely to be a bit slower. So Enzo does castle kingside. I play e6. I'm still looking to catch up in development here. I'm pretty happy with my setup. This is extremely solid, but I do recognize that I need to get my king to safety, and I don't want to get too ambitious. So now, many options for white. One thing that Engine tends to like in this type of position is going after the light square bishop. So knight h4. In a lot of these Scandinavians, it's almost always the top preference of the Engine in like a more kind of static, predictable position to go after the light square bishop. So I could maybe imagine some players doing this, but honestly, I didn't expect it based on how the game had progressed, white using a lot of time and having just castled kingside. Because let's imagine bishop g6, knight takes g6, h takes g6 is played. I would be threatening mate here. The computer thinks this is fine for white. They can block mate with a move like this, but a lot of human opponents will not want to allow that. So maybe I would have castled queenside and tried to play aggressively, maybe go after the pawn on h2 later. But white chose a different direction entirely. They played the move d5. Pawn d5. So now trying to blast open the center. And I played c takes d5. We got to capture that pawn. And I thought white was going to take with the knight. And in fact, this is what I had spent a little bit of time on a couple moves prior, just making sure that I would be safe if this were the case. So I was anticipating knight takes, hitting my queen, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and then likely moving my bishop somewhere, either e7 or possibly d6. Probably e7 just to block here. And I'm not exactly threatening to take the bishop now, or at least if I castled, I wouldn't be. Maybe in the current position I am, but if white were to play something like rook e1, that would be a really bad idea. But it might buy me enough time to just be able to castle short and stabilize the position. Hard for white to justify taking on e6 here. That's just going to be a really bad decision if white does that. But I did see it might get interesting if white played something like knight d4, attacking the bishop and trying to concentrate one more attacker here. So I was trying to calculate some lines like this. I didn't quite believe that some sort of sacrifice on e6 would work. Let's say a line like this, trying to hit the queen and also the pawn here. I think I can play queen e5. I wouldn't be all that upset if white went for something like this and then took the rook here, because I do like the activity of the minor pieces, despite white having a rook and 2 pawns. But I was anticipating some road like that where knight takes d5 would be the move after I took with the c pawn. But instead, my opponent surprised me. He took with the bishop. So captures on d5 with the bishop. Clearly, I think looking for knight takes d5 after I take, purely trying to gain the tempo on the queen. It would be far too dangerous to take a pawn down on c2. That I think runs into stuff like rook c1 and then knight c7 to come, probably among other moves. Maybe knight d4 or something's also good. But I don't have to take the bishop, is the thing. So on bishop takes d5, I simply played bishop e7. I'm content with developing. And my opponent played rook e1. So similar tactic to what I just mentioned. I can't take on d5 here with the pawn because I would get mated. But I just went ahead and castled short. So get kingside castled. The queenside is looking fairly open now, so castling queenside did cross my mind to attempt to unbalance the position. But again, I'm not opposed to playing an equal position, a more calm position against a lower rated player. I don't look at those positions as inherently drawish. I look at them as open-ended and a possibility to outplay someone. And again, if there's a rating gap, you will get plenty of opportunities to outplay someone, so you don't have to force complications and imbalances. So I was more than happy to castle here. And now my opponent did retreat the bishop. Possibly white could leave the bishop in the center a little longer if they were really trusting of this queen takes e7 resource. But I get the sense white didn't want to have to calculate that, and probably they will have to move it quite soon anyways. Maybe they were worried about the c2 pawn as well. So bishop b3 is logical. Now I was assessing this position, and I thought I was fine, first of all. I thought the position was close to equal, maybe slightly better for me. We're talking a quarter pawn because I do have a center pawn and my opponent does not. In looking at the pawns in general, actually, it's hard to see how white is going to whip up any pawn play in the short term. Whereas this e6 pawn is kind of nice, like controlling some territory. I also somewhat preferred how my minor pieces were arrayed. And I decided to play another pawn move here. I played a6. I thought controlling b5 would be helpful in almost every case here. Just rule out my opponent's knight jumping there. I think knight c5 is also a good move. Eyeing up this bishop here and continuing to reinforce. But I play a6. And Restelli responded with rook a d1. Natural move, centralizing. But again, he'd spent a lot of time at this point, and I must have misplaced the score sheet. I think it's on my countertop some 10 feet away, so I can't reach it. But at this point, white had used more than half his time. And I could kind of sense he was casting around for a plan. He probably understood that some of these moves were not exactly creating threats, but it's still very much a coherent position for white. It's just going to be hard to find a plan, I'd say. So rook a d1. You know, I was thinking knight d4 might be an option too, hitting the bishop again and once more trying to put some pressure on e6. I was planning on meeting this with bishop g4, counterattacking the queen, trying to induce f3 so I can respond with bishop c5, going after this pin knight. But the computer points out an amazing reply to bishop g4 that was not on my radar. It's the move knight d5. So jumping up, hit the queen, also hits the bishop. And if I take with the knight, my bishop on g4 is undefended, and white has the bishop pair. This might be a tiny, tiny bit better for white. So nice little counterattacking resource. If I were to take the queen on e2, then knight takes c7, this is not good for me because I have multiple things under attack. Also, if pawn takes on d5, white can take the bishop here. This is another way that white can gain the bishop pair advantage. Also, I have a loose pawn, and I don't think the queen's going to get trapped because it can escape this way if she needs to. So knight d4 would have been interesting. I don't know that I would have ultimately played bishop g4, but it's cool to see that knight d5 actually works out fine for white. But that did not come to pass. White played this rook d1 move, and now I played knight c5. So bringing the knight up, hitting the bishop, reinforcing e6, just like I said. In some ways, this actually reminds me of the Rubinstein variation of the French. Those of you who play the French defense may kind of relate, because often you get this configuration of the knights, this pawn sitting on e6. And I was just pretty happy to play another useful move, be able to threaten to take the bishop pair. And despite white's decent-looking pieces, I didn't see a whole lot that white could do here. So white played bishop e3 in reply. And again, these moves were coming real slow. I had a fair amount of time. I wasn't playing at blitz speed or anything, but I was ahead on the clock. And here's another good example of my philosophy when playing lower-rated players. I could try to just grab the bishop pair right here. There's nothing wrong with this move. But given the difficulty it seemed that my opponent had in producing baseline good decisions and the time it was taking him, I thought, let's just play a flexible and useful move again. And I was looking around at my position, and I thought, well, how about h6, which is what I played. Kind of classic pawn move in front of the king, create luft for the king, be able to escape at any point. Also, if knight h4, it's kind of nice to have the option of bishop h7 in a lot of cases. Just tucking that bishop away if I ever need to. Controls the g5 square, and it throws the move back at white. Because I didn't really see what white was going to do. Like, yeah, white has the d file, but where's white going down that file? I've got everything covered. And my opponent replied with h3. So maybe he had a similar feel that we were kind of at a bit of a standoff in terms of direct attacking moves or anything. We're both playing some useful moves. I played rook c8. I could put a rook on the d file, but why even give my opponent a chance to trade rooks, right? If I play rook a d8 or rook f d8, it just seems too easy for white to swap a pair of rooks and go rook d1. And again, I'm not worse. I'm still probably a tiny, tiny bit better because I can take the bishop at any point and double white's pawns, but I don't want to give my opponent any unnecessarily easy decisions. And it's hard to think that way, by the way, in chess. That takes a while to understand what your opponent is going for, especially on a strategic level. So don't feel if you're rated 1,000, 1,200 even, certainly below that, that's something you should be constantly thinking about. Yeah, you should be trying to understand what your opponent's doing, but this is quite nuanced, I will fully admit. If you're thinking about what your opponent's doing on a larger calculation level and what they're trying to do tactically, that's quite good, and that should be a good baseline for you. But don't worry about kind of this more subtle metagame type stuff right now. Like, that will come with time. So no easy decisions for my opponent. I played rook ac8. I thought the c file might be useful, and I wasn't unhappy about my rook being there. And I thought I can always put the other rook on d8 if I want. And what happened? My opponent played a bit of a mistake here. So I think he should play something like bishop d4, centralizing and unveiling the queen and the rook, maybe flirting with bishop e5, possibly knight d4 as well. I think this makes more sense because of the pressure here, and I can't come to g4. But he played bishop takes c5, captures the knight. And I was much happier to get the dark square bishop than taking white's light square bishop, because if I take the light square bishop, although I do get to double the pawns, I actually feel this is a much more influential bishop for white on e3 because it patrols both sides of the board. I could see white taking either way here, actually, if I were to take on b3, maybe even this one, and try to post a rook here. Whereas the light square bishop, to me, seemed just pretty blunted for white. I didn't see a great future for this bishop because I have multiple pawns already on light squares, limiting its scope, whereas this dark square bishop was more unencumbered. So I was pretty happy to see bishop take c5. I felt it was a mistake by white, and I felt like my advantage was now growing. So I took back with the bishop. White went knight d4. This hits my bishop, and again hits the pawn on e6. But I pretty quickly replied with bishop g6 at this point. Drop the bishop back, preserving the bishop pair. I could go to h7, but I slightly prefer g6 in this instance because it doesn't block my king if I ever want to go to the h7 square. And now, interesting moment. If you're paying attention, you might see that white has a potential tactic on e6. Okay? So white could play knight takes e6 here, f takes e6, and then bishop takes e6 check, forking my king and my rook. And then on king h7, bishop takes c8, let's say rook takes c8 or queen takes c8. What do you guys think the evaluation of this position is? If you want to consider it for a moment. Who stands better here and why? Or is it equal? Okay, so in game, I felt like if this position came to pass, that I would be clearly better. Maybe on the order of like a +1 type situation. I'm clicking on Stockfish right now. And feel free to run this for yourself. I will link this game. Stockfish 14 that I'm running here on Lee Chess says -4. Or +4 for black. So a 4-point advantage in my favor, which is wild because material-wise, white is doing fine, right? If you go purely by white having a rook and 2 pawns against the 2 minor pieces. But the engine thinks this position is essentially lost for white. And that's something that you sometimes see with a trade of minor pieces for a rook and a pawn or rook and 2 pawns. There's that classic potential trade on f7 or f2 that many e4, e5 players will be familiar with. I've talked about that at length in videos. But basically, it's going to be extremely difficult for white to create threats with these rooks. And the bishops are so active. The minor pieces in general are so active for black here. Look at the potential pressure against f2. And if I take with the queen, maybe that's even more palpable. If I move this knight, let's say white does something like this and we get a knight h5 type move. There's immediate pressure here, which white is going to have to go passive in order to defend. Not to mention, there's maybe even this move bishop h5 that I could flick in and go after the queen and the rook here, try to induce g4. Maybe white even has queen d3. But there's all these annoying little prods that black has, whereas for white, there's very little to attack here. White still can't make use of these files, right? Look at all the squares down those files that are controlled. Guess we can even count e6 to some extent. At least the squares deep in black's camp are under control. No weak pawns. It feels a little squishy, like what I'm saying here. You might have to play around with the position like this to really understand. But there are many ways I can create threats, and white has a hard time creating threats. Because these blunt instruments, these heavy pieces, just don't really have much of an effect in this position. Whereas these bishops and the knight, maneuvering in, causing problems with skewers and pins, do a much better job of that. Now, if you take queens off the board, or maybe there are fewer pawns for black, and the king is more exposed, I think that could be a different story. That's why this material balance can be better for the side with the rook and the pawns the closer you are to an endgame, but not in this case. And again, I'd encourage you to maybe look at this a little bit with the engine if you want to convince yourself of that. But probably f2 would be the target, I think. This type of plan, maybe even tripling up against f2, possible shift over to attack the g2 pawn in some cases. Probably white's going to lose something at some point. So I was hoping my opponent would go for something like that. It's a tempting little idea because material-wise it seems fine. But if we look a little bit deeper, it's not great for white. In fact, it's pretty bad for white. So at this stage, I pulled the bishop back to g6. My opponent played queen f3. Very low on the clock at this point. White was under 5 minutes here. I had probably 15 or 20 minutes. So white's slightly improving their queen with a move like this. I decided to play rook c to d8 now, going after the knight. And now there's no question that a capture on e6 is not going to work out for white. So white retreated, plays knight d back to e2. And I really liked my next move. I actually emailed with a student about this moment. I had sent him the game after it was played, and he said, oh, there's some subtle moves here, like this move bishop d6 that you played in this position. And that is what I did. Pull the bishop back. This is along the same lines. I'm not trying to give white any easy decisions. And I did this for two reasons, just in terms of the position. One, I do not want white to be able to trade rooks. So let's say I play something like b5, advance a pawn. I thought white can swap and then play rook d1. That's boom. Just two easy moves white can play, trying to simplify. Okay, black's still better here. It's fine. But why even give them that option? And probably more importantly, I didn't want this knight to come to f4. That seemed like kind of an annoying square, knight f4, hitting the bishop and the pawn. Even if I'm not scared of the e6 capture, I didn't necessarily want to have to put my bishop on h7, which blocks the king from coming here. So bishop d6 just really fit the bill. Prevent rook takes d8 and prevent knight f4, like restricting this knight. You know, after I played this move, it also occurred to me that bishop a7 might be interesting, looking to meet knight f4 with bishop b8, and in general, just preparing this battery towards h2. But the computer prefers the bishop d6 move, as it turns out. So I'm really trying to flex the bishop pair and use the dark square bishop, which doesn't have an opponent. All right, now my opponent played knight g3. So trying to find a useful square for the bishop. Here I went bishop e5, which admittedly does allow a trade on d8. But I felt okay with that because I get some pressure on the knight on c3. So let's say white were to play rook takes d8, rook takes d8, rook d1 here. I thought, well, I can take on d1. If queen takes, I kind of have a dealer's choice here, taking either knight. I'd probably take this one, in fact, because the queen's no longer helping to defend the g3 point. And if knight takes d1, I think I remember calculating this in game. I can play bishop takes c2 at the end. Grab this pawn, and white can't even up the material by taking on b7 because they would lose the knight on d1. So bishop e5 does allow the rook trade, but white can't play the other rook to d1, so it somewhat diminishes the value of trading the initial pair of rooks. So on bishop e5, my opponent, real low on the clock. I really wish I would have noted the move times here, folks. I think I had a note in here, but I can't find it. I'm pretty sure he had about 2 minutes left to my 15, and he made a mistake. He played knight g to e4. So centralizing the knight. It's a tough position for white. Honestly, the engine's already showing -2. So that's the power of having control with the two bishops, and again, white not having much play with the pawns. Like the pieces all occupy seemingly decent squares, but no real play with that pawn structure. Like that seems like it shouldn't be that big of a deal, but black is really calling the shots here with the bishop pair and easier decisions to make. So I think white should sit tight with a move like a3 or something, but it's not pleasant, and I now have the option of taking here whenever I want. But white played knight ge4, and you can pause your video for a second if you want to figure out why this is a mistake. All right, so I played knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and then bishop takes b2, simply picking off a pawn. And that was a big reason for the bishop e5 move, is that I was x-raying the pawn on b2, I thought, in many lines. So that position came to pass where I took the pawn on b2. At this point, I felt pretty strongly that I was winning, as long as I keep my head screwed on straight and just continue to make good moves. And my opponent's time pressure really helped as well. So he played queen g3, offering a queen trade. I thought for a moment about keeping queens on board, maybe something like queen c6 here. That was a consideration, but I felt that the endgame was winning. So I thought, let's just not overcomplicate this. Let's trade queens. You guys know I love a good queen trade, so we swap. If white takes with the pawn on g3, they would lose a piece. Rook takes d1, rook takes d1, the bishop takes e4. White's rook on e1 would be overburdened here, overworked. So he correctly took with the knight. I played bishop c3, hitting the rook on e1, rook f1, and I'm up a pawn with the bishop pair, better structure to boot. I'm not trying to force too many trades, so I could play rook takes d1 here, but I didn't see the sense in giving white the file. Again, I'm looking to play useful moves here, improve my position, maybe create a little bit of a trap too, if it's low risk. And that's what I did with my next move. I played bishop d4. Because I thought with my opponent being very low on the clock, and just with that 5-second increment only, it's kind of natural to want to step out of the pin here and play a move like king h2. But what happens if white does that? What would I play? I like these pauses, these quizzes, because it gives me a chance to sip my coffee too. Okay, so if you said bishop takes f2, you are correct. Again, trying to profit from the overworked rook that white has. If rook takes f2, I take the rook on d1. And if rook takes d8, trying to solve the rook on d1 first, I throw in this move with check. And then I've ultimately won a pawn in that sequence. I'm up 2 pawns total now. So I kind of like this move. I just thought it was annoying, and I didn't see how white could easily react here. They can maybe play rook d2, by the way. But I saw I could always repeat the position if I wanted something like this, as I wouldn't mind a trade. But instead, white played knight e2, hitting my bishop. Now bishop takes f2 doesn't work. Well, wouldn't have worked before, but white can take with the king and keep this rook defended. So I played bishop e5, just backing off. And I was happy to see the coming sequence because this weakened white. White, who again, very, very low on the clock. They played f4, hitting the bishop. I retreated to c7, keeping an eye on this pawn, also keeping open an option like bishop b6. And then white played g4. And what you're really seeing with moves like this is kind of like a maybe a psychological insight in this game. You're seeing the natural instinct for many players when they're under time pressure and they don't know what to do in a position to lash out. Okay? f4, g4. This actually significantly weakens white's position, even though it seems like it's creating some semblance of a threat going after my bishop. But I was very pleased to see that because I knew that white's king would lack protection. I played the move bishop e4 now. By the way, earlier in the game, bishop takes c5. That's kind of another example of feeling the pressure to do something in the position. So it seemed like white's setup was just becoming progressively weaker. They have to keep an eye on f4. The king has been kind of exposed, like bishop b6 is starting to look more ominous with this bishop controlling the adjacent diagonal. White played knight g3 here, attacking my bishop. This rook is almost overworked again. Rook takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop takes f4 is sort of in the air, but I would lose the bishop on e4. So first I just solved that issue. I played bishop c6. Notice the lovely bishops standing next to one another. White took on d8. So finally deciding to do something with this because this is a threat now, taking on d1 and bishop takes f4. So I take back with my rook, seizing the file. And now I have in mind rook d2 coming into the second rank because guess what? My bishop on c6 can help create a threat towards that white king with rook to g2. And if white tries to guard against that rook f2, trying to guard d2 and f4, well, guess what? There's bishop b6 coming into the picture with a deadly pin. So white can't really do much here. Extra pawn and most importantly, the 2 bishops, much better pieces. White's fate is sealed. They played bishop c4, trying to repurpose the bishop a little bit. I did dive into the second rank. Main threat, rook g2, but also rook takes c2 now. White played knight to e2, guarding against the rook g2 threat. I think bishop e2 might help defend on the king side a little bit longer, but I can always just pick off a pawn here and take this pawn in my sights as well. Oh, and there's also, I saw a fun move g5 if I ever want to go for that at some point. Threatening the pawn on f4, and white can't take because they lose the knight. So knight e2 played. I picked off the pawn on c2, attacking the bishop on c4 with tempo. Bishop d3. White could try something like rook c1 here, but that's at minimum going to lead to another loss of a pawn. I'll be up 3 pawns here. So bishop d3 played instead. Rook d2 hit the bishop. Bishop came back to c4. And what do you guys think? What should black do at this point? How can I bring my advantage full circle here? Okay, most anything normal is going to win here, but b5 is really nice. Attacking the bishop, which can no longer remain guarding the knight safely. Just a few more moves were played. White played rook c1. I took the bishop on c4. Rook takes c4. And now my bishops had their full glory. Bishop b6 check. White's trying to counterattack the two pieces here. I do also have the attack on the knight, but I saw a way to just bring this to its conclusion. Bishop b6. And king h2 is met by rook takes e2 with check. So white played king f1, defending the knight, but this runs into rook d1 checkmate. So mate on the board with all these squares covered. Again, look at the role of the two bishops cutting off the white king. All right, so I'd say a fairly smooth victory for me here in round 1 of the Charlotte Memorial Game in 45+45 tournament. Pretty thorough analysis I think I just did. And I'll just, again, emphasize this big theme of not trying to overdo it when playing lower rated players. This can even be a model when playing players around your own rating, possibly players even higher rated than you. Too many players, in my opinion, feel the need to complicate and enforce complexity on the board rather than just letting the position develop. Because trust me, most players cannot play 40 good, solid moves. They will make a mistake, and I would include myself in that bucket too. If I'm playing a good player, I have a real hard time playing dozens of good moves in a row. At some point, if the stronger player is playing baseline good moves and maybe creating some subtle pressure, the lower rated player is going to make a mistake. So keep that theme in mind. It's not something that's always going to work, but maybe it'll be useful for you to remember, just having that peace of mind that even if you're in a boring, symmetrical looking position, there will be opportunities to outplay your opponent by them making mistakes mainly, and you not having to force them to make mistakes. So I think my opponent, for their rating and playing up, playing in IM, played reasonable chess, but some of these decisions were just not testing enough. And in some cases, just gave away what might have been like a slight disadvantage, kind of gave that away and pushed it more into clear advantage territory. I think bishop takes c5. I think it's already pretty tough for white at that point. Certainly knight e4. I think white needs to exercise some patience here because this move did lose a pawn when I took on b2. But one of the hardest things to do is just sit there and do nothing in chess. Most people lash out. You even saw this later with f4 and g4. So instructive game. And thanks to my opponent for the game. Good young player. He's going to be climbing the rating ladder, no doubt. I think he's actually already over 1,800. So thanks to him for the game. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, anything on the Scandi I can answer. We did see this little move order wrinkle, knight bd7 in the opening. And round 2, I play a high 1900s rated player. And it's an interesting game, so I'll be eager to share it with you guys. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.